Hi. We come today to the final vision of John's revelation, that of New Jerusalem coming down out of the sky to be there for the people of God. And as we do, there are a number of ways that the structure of John's vision here in Revelation pulls together all kinds of pieces, both as you can see on the right side of the screen, the last 6 chapters from 17:1 to 22:5, but also, as we'll see in a minute, the entire book, both echoing the opening chapters, as we saw in chapter 19 and 20 as well, but also shaping a rough chiasm that holds the whole book together. It also is the most extensive use of Hebrew scripture in any section of Revelation, and that's really saying something. And as John uses Hebrew scripture to express this vision of ultimate hope here, of New Jerusalem welcoming people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation with God tented in their midst, he adapts many of the elements of the tradition that he's inherited to express his understanding of the victory of the Lamb over the dragon. So if you haven't watched the previous video, number 75, with the overview of visions of ultimate hope and how the inheritance of the tradition that John had from his biblical and extra biblical texts and traditions echoes into our text here and also is changed to express the unique element of Jesus as the Messiah and as the slain and risen Lamb. So you can see there on focusing on the chiasm of these last chapters, it should be no surprise that the judgment on the harlot or the whore of Babylon is parallel to the vindication of the bride. And this helps us see how these sections fit together, of why the business of Satan in prison for 1,000 years and the saints reigning or judging for 1,000 years is placed there in between to make this chiastic shape. And the parallels between Babylon and New Jerusalem are tremendous. And you can see from this chart, which is adapted from Anthony Withers in my book, Unveiling Empire, how stark they are. So if we look at it chiastically, we can see this is the A part and this is the A prime part, and they're parallel. But we can also see how at every point New Jerusalem is the theological opposite of Babylon. It's gift as opposed to for sale, and we'll look at all those details as we go. Um, as I just was noting, there are also these echoes of the opening chapters and many echoes of that, and we'll look more at that as we go, but I want to highlight just the shape of that before we get started. So here on the left side are our current chapters 21 and 22, and on the right side are the opening chapters 1 through 3. And you can see, without my going through that, a number of the echoes, but there are also echoes, like, for example, we see here where the word for apostles is only one other time in all of Revelation, than 21:14 and 2:2. So plainly, these are not just the words happen to be in both places, but the phrases and words are either uniquely in both places or almost uniquely in both places. So as I scroll this, you can see through a number of connections that link the beginning and the end. And that connects with this roughly chiastic shape. And I call it roughly because it isn't perfectly a chiasm, as I'll show you in just a moment, but there certainly is this shape. So in the introduction in chapter 1, we saw John was called to commanded to write what he sees, and we see the same thing here at the end. There are also some other details of that. In chapters 2 and 3, the messages in the one letter to the churches, to the ecclesiae in the Roman province of Asia. So cities are addressed there. And in the end, cities are addressed here, of Babylon, the fate of Babylon, and the emergence of New Jerusalem. And there are 3 sets of 7. So how do you shape those 3 sets of 7 chiastically? Well, it makes sense that the middle one is in the middle, right? So except it isn't quite like that, because also in the middle of the text is these chapters here. So if we were to look at it from the perspective of the sequence of chapters 1 through 22, the 3 sets of 7 are not chiastically shaped. So I put it here with the first scroll with its 7 seals and the 7 trumpets on one side, and the 7 bowl plagues on the other side, and then this section here from 10 to 14 with the second scroll and the witness, the woman and the child, and all that in the middle. Again, roughly chiastic, because other than the fact that there's 7, there's no particular reason to match the bowl plagues with 2 pairs of 7s here, but we see this rough shape. And John is certainly not writing to make a chiasm, but it's to highlight the cyclical nature of this, that this is not a sequence of events in chronological order, as I've said a number of times, but a cyclical way of reporting what he's seen in this vision. And as I was noting, the echoes of Hebrew scripture are immense. And I color-coded this on purpose with the Ukrainian flag because there's some sense that Ukraine's war against Russia and Putin here is not that different than the Lamb's war against the dragon. Of course, there are differences. There's a physical war there, and Ukraine is using weapons and bombs, and so it's not the power of words versus the power of violence. But there's certainly the sense that Ukraine is a victim of empire, and much of the world has come to its aid as it resists that, even if it's not resisting it in other than imperial modes. But just in honor of that, I wanted to remember that here as it's taking place while I'm making this video. And so we see the links between Revelation on the left side and Hebrew Scripture on the right side, including texts like First Enoch, are tremendous. And I won't go through them all now. We'll go through them as we go. But I just want you to see roughly how tightly connected here chapter 21 and 22 is to Hebrew Scripture. As we saw last time, particularly to the shape of Ezekiel, but also much to Isaiah and other texts as we can see, including the Exodus as you see there. So on and on it goes, and I'm not even done scrolling through this yet to see all the echoes of Hebrew Scripture that are in these last couple of chapters. So as we enter into the beginning of chapter 21, we also see this this chiasm for the first 5 verses. And this is the part that we're going to be going over now. And thanks to David Auney for that chiastic shape. So as we enter into this, I'll leave the echoes of Hebrew Scripture on the right side so we can see how deeply John's vision is connected to that as we go. So then I saw, which is the last of the Chi Edons here, the 7th of 7 in 1911 to 21:1. I posted a chart of those earlier, so you can go back and see that in the 1911 video. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And plainly, the image of a new heaven is not unique to John. We see it from Isaiah 65, and we also see it from 1st Enoch. What are we imagining that is, though? I want to remind that every time we hear the word heaven, if you just hear sky, sky and earth here, that's what's at issue. Certainly, sky and earth echo Genesis 1, the separation of the waters and the land into earth and sky, and the waters above the sky and the waters on the earth. And so there's certainly an echo of that here. But what does it mean that the sky and the earth go away, as we saw last time, fled from the throne, and a new one is put here? Um, a number of ecologically oriented scholars and readers have been bothered by this, that why not heal and restore the old earth rather than replace it with the new one? And that has to do with the various visions of ultimate hope that we looked at. There is the possibility of a vision of Eden restored and earth restored. That's just not what John's vision is here. But we have to recognize that in the mystical poetic way that he's presenting this here, what his text suggests, consistent with our modern way of understanding the possibilities of creation, is whether we think of it as a multiverse that's so popular in sci-fi stories these days, of parallel universes or sequential universes, there's no limit to God's creativity. The fact that God could make creation once does not mean that God only made creation once or could only make creation once. So although we think of the universe as something permanent, it's plainly not permanent. We know that scientifically. There's a Big Bang or something like that that began it, and there's going to be some kind of cosmic conclusion to it, it seems, whether that's eternal expansion or contraction. But it's to say it's all in motion, and so it's not fixed. It's moving and it's changing, and so it could disappear and it could reappear. So no limit to the possibility of God's creative power, and that's what John's at work here. Let's see empire do something like that. So a new heaven and new earth, the first earth and the first heaven, the first earth had passed away or departed, and we'll see echoes of that as we go. As Lowell notes, there's no continuity between the old and the new. He says the eternity of God is not an immobility, it is a perpetual beginning, a novelty always being born. I think that's really key to what's going on here. So, and the sea was no more. As Molina notes, the traditional symbol of chaos is irrelevant to the New Jerusalem, but as my note below suggests from my own thoughts, also the primary vehicle for imperial intercourse. We noted in chapter 18 that those who mostly lamented the fall of Babylon were those who made money at sea. And we saw the beast from the sea was the first to be empowered by the dragon, which is to say imperial commerce, as well as the imperial military moving around the Mediterranean. So the sea here, both as a symbol of primordial chaos from Genesis and elsewhere, and also in the prophetic books where Leviathan is said to be tamed, and behemoth, sea creatures, as an expression of God's power, but also that imperial commerce cannot exist without the sea. And we can also consider it from a Greek perspective, as we saw in the overview of Visions of Ultimate Hope, the sense of access to the Elysian fields, which are considered to be on islands across the sea. So perhaps with the sea was no more, there'd be access to the Greco-Roman mind as well as to the biblical mind. So sea was no more here, and we'll see variations on that phrase "no more" as we go, which highlights something. And I haven't looked at this yet. Maybe we should look at it now before we get too far into it, how John uses key words in this section. And I've color-coded these in a number of ways. Let's zoom out so you can't read it, but just you can just see the colors. So you see there's this bright red section here and this bright red section here. But it's not a chiasm in itself. It echoes in various ways from beginning to end all over the place. And if I zoom back in on it, you can see in the section we're on now how that's happening. The parts that I have highlighted like this involve individual keywords, but also phrases. So we see this phrase, the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, repeated here. And a number of things like that repeated as we go. And so it's a spiraling, swirling repetition rather than a strict structure of a chiasm that shapes it. And we see a number of elements of that there. So we'll see no more echoing both here, and we'll also see it a number of other times. So I'll leave that version up now. We can't have that in the Hebrew scripture at the same time. So going to verse 2, and I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem. Holy city was not unique to Revelation. It's something that John inherited, and I can bring up the echoes of Hebrew scripture, and you can see that there from both the religion of empire side of Nehemiah and the religion of creation side of Isaiah 52. If you're not familiar with those terms, religion of empire and religion of creation, those are from my book, Come Out My People, and there's more about that in earlier videos. So I saw this holy city. Notice there was a city called the beloved city earlier, and this is not called that here. The holy city, the New Jerusalem. No article in Greek, simply New Jerusalem. So just to highlight that. The new highlights other newness throughout, a new name, New Jerusalem, new songs, a new heaven, new earth, and all things new. So God, who always has the power to renew things and make things new, coming down out of heaven from God. I can't emphasize this too much. In the overview video, one of the principles I wanted to highlight is that people can naively misread this as this is heaven. That New Jerusalem is a description of heaven with its gates like a pearl. It reminds people of the image of pearly gates, etc. But that's exactly what's not being said here. This is coming down out of the sky. It is not in the sky, and it's not in heaven, or it was in heaven, but it's coming down. It doesn't say it lands on earth, but it's made visible to John coming out of the sky. So it's not the destination of people when they die. It's a replacement of creation with a new heaven and a new earth. So it's right here in this world that this is happening, although it's a new world, but not a world on the other side of the veil. So coming down out of heaven from God here, and Gilchrist, whose book on Revelation 21 and 22 and what he calls utopian visions, I've noted in the overview video, he suggests this is part of the Roman tradition of the Laus Urbis, the praise of the city, invoking its designer founder. And he goes that in much detail, which is to say New Jerusalem's founder is God. And so God is going to be praised here in these opening verses. And as we'll note, the first section of 21, after announcing that it comes down out of heaven from God, is really about the relationships between God and humanity. It's not until this is repeated a second time that we get the detailed description of the city with its gates and walls and streets and tree. But right now, the emphasis is on the celebration of this restored, renewed intimacy between God and humanity, which we'll see in the next verse. And it starts with the wedding image here. Prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Notice that prepared as a bride plays with a little tension over against 19:7. His bride has made herself ready, the same word for prepared here. So here it suggests she has prepared herself, and in 21 it suggests she's been prepared, presumably by her attendants. And whether we think of that as the heavenly attendants, the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures, or just as a metaphor, we don't have to decide. So prepared as a bride for her husband. We only saw bride earlier in chapter 18, but it's certainly highlighting images from Isaiah of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel as a husband with his bride, the intimacy there that's going on, the love relationship, rather than simply the king and the vassals element that we see in the Exodus story, God being their king and Israel being their people if they entered the covenant. So here's this bride adorned or made beautiful for her man, not for her husband. There is no word for husband in Greek. And this is the only place in the entire book of Revelation where you hear the word for a male person, aner, which is a curious thing here, only here in Revelation. So then he hears a loud voice. 20 times in Revelation we hear the loud voice coming from the throne. Presumably is not the voice of God because it's speaking about God. It could be, but God could be speaking of God's self. That happens in the prophets, but it's not specified. This contrasts with Ezekiel 43, where God's throne is in the temple, um, as we see here. And that's one of the huge differences, is there is no temple in New Jerusalem, and we'll see that explicitly as we go. So one of the many edus, behold, that's not translated directly by the New RSV, see or behold, and this is where we need to look up close. Home is very misleading, and all of this is very misleading, home and dwell, because the word is skene, which means to tent. The verb for tent or the noun for tent. God's tent here as a noun is among human beings. He will tent with them, using the verb. And so after all the imperial scenes we've seen of thrones and grandeur, and what we'll see with New Jerusalem, God's presence in New Jerusalem looks like this: out on the street of the city like a homeless person. And we call people in tents in the city homeless, even though they're in a tent, because tents are conflicting with cities. They don't belong there. And yet many of our cities, at least in the United States, and maybe where you live if you don't live in the United States, are filled with those kinds of tents. Certainly, John was not suggesting that God's tent in the middle of the city meant that he was poor and a reject. It meant more that he was intimate and accessible. But certainly a tent on the street of the Roman world would be even less normal and acceptable than we've allowed tents to be in our world. The poor would have been pushed aside outside the city, or to certain corners of it. It would not be on the streets of the great city, as we'll see it described in a little while. So God's vulnerable tent, echoing also the tent of meeting with Moses, which isn't explicit here. But we see from the Hebrew scripture, this is not unique, that Ezekiel has the same verb in a different form here. There are a couple of other places where the affirmation of they shall be my people and they will be their God is found, as in Zechariah and Leviticus, not necessarily using the tent word, but Zechariah uses it here as well. And so it's not unique to John. He's pulling that out of the tradition. The intimate God whose tent is in the street of the city with them. And the with them provides for an interesting element of intimacy here. We can't see this in English, but the generic Greek pronoun autos for all pronouns, it gets changed into he's or she's and such by different forms, but there's one root word, is 6 times in this verse, expressing the intimacy of relationship between God and the people. So where we see it with them here, or his or himself, but there's more times of it than it makes for smooth reading in English. So really highlighting the relational element. And they will be God's peoples, plural. In Ezekiel's vision, it's singular. It's meant for the returning exiles who turn away from their sinfulness and form this new community from the symbolism of the dry bones that are breathed in by God. So it's to say those who had been part of it will be invited to be a part of it again after exile. But John's vision here is much more expansive. It again goes back to God's original vision in Genesis, that everybody made in the image of God is invited, and it's just a matter of a choice. As we'll see in the next video in verse 8, where there are others who choose not to, who just refuse out of their God-given free choice to go along with this. And their fate is in the lake of fire, as we'll see. So they will be his peoples, plural, and God self will be with them. And he will wipe every tear from their eye, a beautiful image from Isaiah, and also intimate. Notice not just that there will be no more crying, but the image of wiping every tear like a parent with a child. Every tear from their eyes, and death, mourning, crying, and pain will be no more. Notice in a seeming reverse order that pain can lead to crying, which is an outcry, and mourning follows perhaps from death, but death, the greatest of these, will be no more. Thanatos, destroyed. We already saw that death had been in the lake of fire. Then why the will here? Well, let's not worry grammar about future and past. It's all present tense for God. So no more mourning here. Was only in chapter 18 highlighting those who mourn the fall of Babylon. And here for the residents of New Jerusalem, there's nothing to mourn. It's only one other time in the New Testament, but often used in the Hebrew scripture in the Septuagint for mourning in the face of evil and injustice. So not necessarily about death itself, but about the state of reality. The word for crying here, krage, is only here in Revelation, and as we see in Genesis 18 or in Exodus 3:7, used as the cry of the poor, the oppressed. In Genesis 18, around the people of Sodom who cry out, and in Exodus 3:7, the Israelites under Egyptian slavery. So there'll be no more reason to cry out because there'll be no more oppression, because God in their midst will be their king, and there'll be nobody ruling over them and having power over them. The first things have passed away. Um, and our chiasm completes in verse 5 here. And the one who is seated on the throne said, Behold, again, Edu, I am making all things new. It's present tense here rather than future. As Beale notes, a prophetic present expressing not specific current happening, but certainty that it will happen. From God's perspective, it's already happened, but from human perspective, it hasn't happened yet. The Roman Empire is still there for John's audience, but all things will be made new. In the process of making new, as we saw in the previous video, something like the Gandhi image used in the Catholic work tradition of making the new within the shell of the old. So making all things new, and then told to write this, for these words are trustworthy and true, forming part of the connection with the opening verses, as we saw earlier. Trustworthy here, pistoi, which we could say faithful, but noting the parallel with the imperial virtue of fide and Latin, or pistis in Greek, to be loyal, much like patriotism, a word for patriotism, to be loyal to the empire. But it's these words of the Creator God that are trustworthy and true. And as you can see on on verse 6, we won't go there now, it is named as something already done, not a prediction of the future. So this will go on to describe what this New Jerusalem already given as a gift from God on the throne to people in place of the destroyed Babylon, what it looks like. We'll see more of the details of that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.